Welcome back to lecture number 5. All right, in this lecture, I'm going to cover John Stuart Mill Hedonism. This is on page 11 of your textbook. Also, Chris Heatwood, Faring Well and Getting What You Want. And I'm going to talk about Brad Hooker, The Element of Well-Being, and Robert Nozick, The Experience Machine. Okay. So let's start with hedonism. Do you ever think about how your life can be better? I think about it a lot. And in order to know how life can be better, we have to know how can life be good. So we need a standard to determine the level of well-being or welfare. There are many things in life that can make life good. For example, money, friends, success, food, sports, education, power, sex, notoriety, clothes, art, love, pizza, health, vaccination, and of course the iPhone 11. Well, all these goods here that I mentioned, well, maybe not all of them, but most of them were known as instrumental good. Maybe you heard that before. An instrumental good is something that is pursued for the sake of the consequences. For example, take money. Why do you really want money? Why does anybody want money? Well, the answer is not because of money itself, but for what money can do for you. If you have money, you can buy things, you can pay bills, and do a lot of interesting things. But if you're not interested in the money itself, what I mean is you're not interested in the currency itself, but rather you're interested in the value of money, the instrumental value. Contrast that with intrinsic value. These are things that are pursued for their own sake. For example, happiness. If I ask you, why do you want money? Well, certainly because I want to be happy, because money can bring happiness. But then if I ask you, why do you want to be happy? I think the justification ends there. You will say to me, I want to be happy because I want to be happy. No other reason. Now, hedonism starts by asking an important question. Is there an ultimate good? An ultimate good for human beings? What is the ultimate good, if there is one? So, an ultimate good would be something like an intrinsic good, something that is good in itself, something that does not require any other explanation, any further explanation. It is good, period. Now, there are different value theories in ethics. These value theories theorize what could be the ultimate good. There are subjective theories and objective theories. Obviously, the subjective theories are going to argue that what the good is, what makes life good, is something subjective. For example, what I want. What if I don't want money? and I want, I don't know, a collection of stamps, or I just want to go to Central Park every morning and take a walk. Okay, so these are personal things. You're not going to be happy going to Central Park every morning. I will. So subjective theories argue that's precisely what I'm talking about. You see, there are things in life that make certain people happy, but not others. So happiness is to be pursued, is to be found in what you want, in a subjective good. On the other hand, objective theories will argue that that's not true. That there are certain things, certain goods that when you have in life, your life will be better no matter what. What if I don't want, for example, friendship? Okay, if you have friendship in your life, objective theories argue, some objective theories argue, if you have friendship, your life will be better. But what if I don't want friendship? Well, an objective theorist would say, I don't care that you don't want friendship. Whether you like it or not, you are going to be happy. Now, hedonism, hedonism is the idea that the ultimate good is happiness. So that makes hedonism, what do you think, a subjective or an objective theory? Well, I would say it's an objective theory, because it says if you have happiness in your life, you're going to be happy, whether you like it or not. According to hedonism, happiness is a sufficient and a necessary condition for a good life. What that means is that it is sufficient and necessary. Sufficient because as long as you have it, your life is good. And necessary means that if you don't have it, there's no other way to have a good life. Now, there is an important distinction between psychological and ethical hedonism. Psychological hedonism is the idea that human beings, psychologically, we are made in such a way that we always pursue happiness. Whether God made us this way or nature or whatnot, it doesn't matter. The important point is that we, as beings, human beings, pursue happiness. This is not a controversial theory or assertion. This is accepted by many. Contrast this with ethical hedonism. Ethical hedonism says that we ought to pursue happiness. Not only that we are made in such a way that we pursue happiness, but we ought to pursue it because it's the right thing to do for us. Now, another division between individualistic and universalistic hedonism. When we go back to the ancient world, there were two very important figures, two ancient Greek philosophers with the name of Erysipelas and Epicurus. They both proposed a version of individualistic hedonism. Erysipelas, they're very different though. Erysipelas argued that we ought to pursue pleasure, and a lot of pleasure. Everything that increases the amount of pleasure in our lives should be pursued. and it is good. Now, the problem with this kind of theory by Erysipelas is that Erysipelas believed that what follows from this simple argument is that human beings, in order to have a good life, need to pursue pleasure to the maximum power. So short episodes of intense pleasure. Not long, because long are boring, and you can fit fewer in your life. You want to fit in your life as many experiences and episodes of pleasure as you can. The moral good, Erysipelas says, has nothing to do with the recollection of past enjoyments or with the hope of new ones. So what this means is that when you live your life, if you want to live a good life, you have to pursue always new episodes of intense pleasure. Okay? Don't think about past. Don't dwell on the past. Don't think about the future, because future pleasures, for example, tomorrow I'm going to have pizza in a conversation with my friends. That's going to give you some pleasure, but it's not real. It's not here. So this is a philosophy of the here and now, and let's do as much as possible. Let's party all the time. That's Erysipelas. It's a party animal. On the other hand, Epicurus, who was also a proponent of hedonism, individualistic kind of hedonism, he thought that to be happy, you have to pursue pleasure, but a different kind of pleasure, not the physical pleasure that Erysipelas had in mind, of getting drunk, eating a lot, taking drugs, having sex, and so on. For Epicurus, that kind of life excites you too much for your own good, and it's not eventually ultimately leading to a good life. It's going to destroy you, actually, in the end. So what Epicurus had in mind was that we have to pursue some different type of goods, different kinds of pleasures, namely the intellectual pleasures, studying philosophy, reading books, hard work, and so on. Clarity of the mind, not being drunk all the time. That's really conducive to a good life. Now, in the late 1700s, a man known as Jeremy Bentham came up with the idea of universalistic hedonism. According to Jeremy Bentham, it is true that life is good if we pursue pleasure. What kind of pleasure? Well, all kinds of pleasure. So in a way, he is close to Erysipelas about pleasure. All kinds of pleasure makes your life good. Now, he didn't make any distinction between pleasure. So what's fundamentally valuable and what ultimately motivates us is pleasure and pain, according to Jeremy Bentham. You can't deny this fact. Human beings can say whatever they want, but ultimately we are driven by pleasure or pain. So happiness is a matter of experiencing pleasure and the lack of pain. So Bentham admits that there's no justification for this. There's no direct proof of this. Or, well, probably it's safe to say that according to Bentham, the only proof is, as they say, the proof is of the pudding is in the making. Just ask yourself, be honest. What exactly do you want in life? You want pleasure, and you want to avoid pain. That's what everybody wants. In the introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, he wrote the following: nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm. That's the argument, essentially. So, as you can see, notice what Bentham is doing here. He says, nature, he starts with nature. So the starting point of morality and a good life is nature. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of these two masters, pain and pleasure. It's not my fault, it's not my decision, it's nature. Okay? Now remember what I said earlier, that there is psychological hedonism and ethical hedonism. So what Bentham is doing here, it seems to me, is moving from psychological or even natural hedonism to moral hedonism. So he's saying, because nature has placed mankind under the governance of pain and pleasure, it follows that we ought to pursue pleasure. Why? Because all human beings are made the same. Whether you come from China or Italy or Texas, we're all the same. We want pleasure and we try to avoid pain. Consequently, according to Bentham, we ought to pursue pleasure. Now, John Stuart Mill, who was the student of Jeremy Bentham, criticized his teacher because many people criticize utilitarianism and hedonism as the doctrine of the swine. It's a doctrine that says all you need is pleasure. Think about it. If you tell people that you want to pursue pleasure in your life, it comes across as a base kind of moral life. You want to pursue pleasure. You're a hedonist. That's the negative connotation of hedonism. When people say all you want in life is pleasure, yes, of course, because that's the only thing that is important in life. But John Stuart Mill criticized his teacher's theory and improved it by introducing a difference between pleasure and pleasure. There are two kinds of pleasure. There's physical pleasure and psychological pleasure, enjoyment. Physical pleasure is the kind one gets from, all the physical things, sex, eating food, etc. Now, Universalistic Hedonism is interested in attitudinal pleasure. The kind of hedonism that John Stuart Mill proposes is Universalistic Hedonism. And his hedonism is interested in attitudinal pleasure. So the pleasure that the psychological pleasure that you get from the enjoyment of, let's say, reading a book, studying philosophy, and so on. So essentially, John Stuart Mill introduces the notion of higher versus lower pleasures. It is true that human beings are driven by pleasure, and they are running away from pain and suffering and misery. But we have to distinguish higher pleasure, like doing hard work, studying, going to college, writing a book, building an airplane, something significant in your life. You know, when your parents tell you, do something significant in your life, that's the higher pleasure that Mill has in mind. On the other hand, the lower pleasures, which, by the way, Mill says they are important. He doesn't deny that they are important, but they are subordinate to higher pleasures. What's the proof for that? What's the proof that higher pleasures are better and more worthy of achievement than lower pleasure? Well, according to Mill, the proof is you. Those who experience both pleasures are the best judges. Think about it. When you were young, much younger, you were more interested in lower pleasures. Say playing a game, doing something silly with your friends, prank your friends, and so on. But now that you're older, you go to school, you learn a lot of things, and also you get pleasure from, for example, discussions about politics, discussions about philosophy. Higher things interest you and give you pleasure. Now, which one do you prefer? Think about it. Would you be interested in going back to a child state? Well, according to Mill, according to this argument, no one would want to regress. It is true, life might be tough when you're older because you have more responsibilities. You have to pay bills, you have to pay debts, you have to think about school, you have to study, you have to do a lot of things. A lot of it is expected from you. But it is true also that at the same time, you gain a lot more pleasure from the activities that you do as an adult. As Mill puts it, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied. It's better to be a human being unhappy than to be a happy pig. Because even if you are unhappy as a human being, you have the autonomy and the capacity to experience important, significant, higher things and pleasures in your life. Okay. Now, hedonism is very attractive because it's egalitarian. What I mean by egalitarian is that it argues that anybody can be happy. Of course, if you have the capacity to experience higher pleasures, that's better. Your life is going to be even better. But essentially, pleasure is pleasure. You don't need any specific faculties to feel pleasure. It just comes natural to you. Now, hedonism then seems to make sense because unhappiness is no good. No one wants unhappiness. But imagine two individuals leading identical lives. One of them enjoys his life while the other one hates it. Now, of course, if you were to choose, you would choose the one who enjoys his life. And that's why hedonism makes sense. However, there are several problems with hedonism. For example, is happiness the only thing that really matters in life? Well, think about this. If that is the case, we should get a lobotomy, and we are all going to be happy. But clearly, that doesn't make sense. A hedonist would respond, why a lobotomy? You're not going to be happy with a lobotomy because you lose your autonomy. Then is it autonomy that makes your life good? Or is it only pleasure? Another problem can be fleshed out by the two worlds hypothesis. Imagine that there are two worlds. In one world, and imagine that both worlds have the same amount of pleasure and misery. Just the same amount, precise. But the first world contains lots of virtuous people. Or assume that all the people there are virtuous. They're kind, they're generous, they're courageous, they're compassionate, and so on. World B, the other world, let's call it A and B, world B has the same amount of pleasure and misery, as I said, but the people are vicious. They're not compassionate, they're not nice, they're not kind, and so on. Now, according to hedonism, that's not a problem because according to hedonism, both worlds are good. They're equally good. But clearly this flies in the face of reason. How can you say that a world that contains miserable people and evil people and vicious people is as good as a world that contains virtuous people? Now, of course, a hedonist can say, well, but look, a world A, which contains all virtuous people, will be better because we'll make the world better as a result of virtue. And so virtuous people make others happy. And so the level of happiness in world A will be higher by default. No questions about that. But imagine that world A, the one with all virtuous people, has say a plague, sickness, whatever. Imagine something that will bring down the level of happiness to the same level of happiness and misery as the other world will be. Now, the only resort of hedonists is to say, well, when we talk about good life, we're not talking about hypothetical worlds. We are talking about individuals. Perhaps that's the response. Another problem is can be brought out by the paradox of hedonism. Think about it. If happiness is the only thing that matters in life and that makes life good, then surely it is rational for us to pursue it. However, it is not rational to pursue happiness. Therefore, happiness is not the only thing that makes life happy. What do I mean by it is not rational to pursue happiness? Well, what I mean is this. Let me give you an analogy. You know when people say, I'm sure you heard this before, I need to get married, but I can't find a good man or a good woman. And I'm trying hard to find one. And sometimes people say to you, you're not going to find it that way. Because if you try to desperately, every single day, as a job, to find a good husband or a good wife, you'll never find it. You have to let it happen. The same thing is the paradox of hedonism. Think about it. how can you pursue happiness? You will always fail to pursue happiness. What are the things that make you happy? Say, for example, you ask a person, why are you always happy? Well, because I do what I like. And what is it what you like? Well, I collect stamps. Then you try. You pick up this hobby and you try, and it doesn't work for you. And that's the point of the paradox of hedonism. You can never pursue happiness. Happiness is something that happens in your life, but you can't really pursue it. Also, another problem is the problem of evil pleasure. This is obvious, isn't it? If hedonism is true, then happiness is happiness, no matter what. Right? If you obtain happiness through evil deeds, then that makes your life good. But that's false. Therefore, hedonism is false. Now, of course, John Stuart Mill would say, no, this is not the kind of hedonism that I propose. And you're right in saying that. But the kind of hedonism that I propose is one that says that you have to pursue happiness, but in pursuing intellectual higher goods. So no evil, only good things. What about false happiness? What if you think that you're pursuing intellectual higher kinds of goods? What if you think, for example, what if I think that I am a good philosopher when in reality I am, third, fourth tier philosopher, but I think that I am first tier, and that makes me happy. But that would be false happiness. But how can your life be good as a result of false happiness? That's strange. What about life trajectory? This is my favorite one. Think about this scenario. You have two individuals, okay? Individual A starts his life with lots of misery, and then progresses better and better and better to the point where he attains happiness. Now, let's consider individual B. Individual B does exactly the opposite. He starts with a lot of happiness and progresses going down and attaining more and more and more misery. So A goes from bad to good, and B from good to bad. Now, suppose that individual A and individual B have the same amount throughout their lifetime. They have the same amount of pleasure and displeasure or misery. Which life is better? Well, it seems intuitively that the life of the person A, the life of the individual whose life goes better and better and better over time, is the better life of the two. But once again, according to hedonism, both lives are of equal value. And this also applies to the kind of hedonism that John Stuart Mill has in mind. It's a very powerful criticism. And finally, the experience machine. This is what Robert Nozick proposes in order to show why hedonism is false. Now, I'm not going to go over the whole argument. You can read the argument in my PowerPoint. But essentially, let me explain what the the experience machine is. The experience machine is a thought experiment that wants to show that hedonism is false. And it goes like this. Imagine that you are in the Matrix. And scientists have found the way to plug you into a machine where you can choose your life and be happy. You can choose whatever you want. You can choose to live the life of a poet, an artist, a millionaire, whatever you want. You decide. Now, why should we not plug into this machine, according to Nozick? And of course, Nozick recognizes there might be several people who are willing to do it. That's not the point. The point is, why is it that most people, I mean, think about it. Would you want to plug into this machine? According to Nozick, most people will not. And why? Well, according to him, it is because he offers three reasons. We want to do certain things and not just have the experience of doing them. So in other words, if you want to graduate from college, go to grad school, get a PhD, get a big job, it's not the good of these things lies in the doing it, in making it. Okay, you want to do these things because that's what gives you pleasure. Years of studying, yes, it is hard, but in retrospect, when you think about it, I went to school, I study a lot. Those are the experience that people want. It's not just the thought of being an engineer or a professor. That's really not what people want. People want to do the things themselves. They want the experience. It is only because we first want to do the actions that we want the experiences of doing them. That's what he says. The second thing is that we want to be a certain sort of person. Nozick says, someone floating in a tank is an indeterminate blob. So the experience machine is not going to give you a good life, because what gives you a good life is the fact that you are a certain kind of person, not that you think that you are a certain kind of person. You remember earlier the false happiness. That's the kind of idea. If you think about it honestly, would you want to be deluded in life and think that you are the greatest person of the 20th century, the greatest philosopher, the greatest engineer, the greatest student? You don't want to be deluded. Think about it. You say, no, I don't want to be deluded. I'd rather be unhappy and know that I suck than be deluded. At least I know who I am. And that's the point. That's the point. We want to be a certain kind of person, and we want to know that we are. Third, plugging into an experience machine limits us to a man-made reality. There is no actual contact with any deeper reality, though the experience of it can be simulated. Sure, you can simulate an experience. You can simulate having a good conversation. You can simulate anything you want. But that's just a simulation. It's not the experience itself. And once again, that's what we want. We want the experience itself. We want a contact with a deeper reality. Consequently, according to Nozick, how do we explain these things, these three things? We explain it in terms of the fact that hedonism must be false. Because if hedonism is true, then you want to plug into the machine. But no one wants to plug into the machine. Well, maybe no one is exaggerated, but only few people. But in fact, Nozick would say, if those people reflect, will realize that they don't want to be plugged into the machine. Okay, the next one is the desire theory. Now, the desire theory says that hedonism, remember, proposes that happiness is an objective good. Whether you like it or not, that's a good, and it's going to make your life good. So hedonism is an objective theory. On the other hand, the desire theory is a subjective theory. Here is how Chris Heatwood defines the desire theory. Our lives go well when, and only when, we have an interest in something. If you're not interested in say, becoming a professor, studying, reading books, then there's no sense in which your life can go better, can be good. Or wanted to have some other positive attitudes toward it, or it causes us to get something else that we have or will have a positive attitude towards. Think about it. You want your life to be good. You ask around. You go to your professors and of philosophy, or your priest or whatever, and you ask, how can my life be good? And they start telling you several things. The priest says, well, you have to pray. You have to go to church. The philosophy teacher is going to tell you, well, you have to read a lot of books. You have to do a philosophy and contemplate. Or you go to your a personal trainer, and he's going to say, oh, you want your life to be good? Get a gym membership. You try these things, but they don't work for you. So what's up with that? Well, that's the point of Heatwood. He says that's precisely the point. Happiness does not come with a list of fixed things that make people happy. That proves that what makes people happy is what they want, what they desire. Heatwood brings up the example of Ted Bundy. I'm sure you know Ted Bundy was an infamous rapist, a serial killer. He was a lawyer, was very educated. He charmed his victims, but he was a murderer. But according to Heatwood, what would make the life of Ted Bundy a good life, a happy life? Well, certainly murdering and raping his victims. Now, look, all we are saying is that Bundy benefited for a time before he was caught by the police. He benefited from his lifestyle. He's not condoning Ted Bundy. He's not saying go out and rape and murder, because that's the very point. Because if you want to be happy in life, you have to do what makes you happy. That's what good is. So whenever what a person wants to be the case is the case, in fact, this constitutes a benefit for the person. But think about this. If Joe wants the case to be, in fact, that he jumps off the top floor of the Empire State Building, well, how can his life be good? Whatever a person desires, wherever a person's desires are frustrated, this constitutes a basic harm, Heatwood argues. Now, the point is, what if we frustrate Joe's life? What if we grab him before he jumps off the building? In what sense do we make his life bad? making money, freedom, love, and more can make our lives better, but only by being things that we want. But what about Joe? He wanted to die. How does death make your life better? Now, of course, Hitwood would say, no, that doesn't make you better. So that's a false belief. But that's the point. What if you have a false belief? We're going back to the original criticism. What about pleasure and happiness? Well, according to the desire theory, according to Hitwood, pleasure and happiness are not good in themselves. They don't make automatically your life a good life. He says, imagine a creature who's completely indifferent to this feeling. He's referring to happiness or pleasure. He even finds it unbearable. It's hard to imagine a person who finds pleasure and happiness unbearable, but I guess for the sake of argument, try to imagine that. I guess he has a point, if that's possible to imagine. So a person benefits from pleasure and happiness only in the case that he or she desires them. But what if Joe inherits a large sum of money? He did not desire it, but if Joe is like me and many other people, he will greatly benefit from a large sum of money. Consequently, this counterexample seems to undermine the desire theory, because there are instances where things happen to you by accident, you don't desire them, and they improve your life. Now, of course, there are a variety of ways in which you can respond, but this gives you an idea of the problems with such a theory. The next one is the objective list theory. The objective list theory, or in short, the list theory, agrees with hedonism. It says, yes, there are certain things that make your life good. So the list theory is an objective theory. However, there are other things besides pleasure, besides happiness, that make a life good. For example, autonomy. We talked about this before. Pleasure. Knowledge. Knowledge of important matters. Friendship. Significant achievements. Accordingly, a life full of pleasure can be of low quality because it lacks autonomy. Think about it. You have a lot of pleasure. Knowledge of important matters. Friendship, significant achievements. What if you lack these in life? Whether you have a lot of pleasure, that's not going to be a good life. Imagine a scenario where you lack autonomy because you're forced to do things in a certain way, and suppose that these things give you pleasure, intellectual and physical pleasure, but you lack knowledge of important matters, friendship, significant achievements. Well, then your life cannot be good. Those elements are intrinsically good and make your life better whether you like it or not, according to this theory. Their values cannot be reduced to the amount of pleasure they generate. What's the evidence? What's the argument? Well, it's a simple argument. Imagine two identical situations. One person has less than another person of some kind of good. For example, in your life, you have two individuals, right? Individual A, again, and individual B. Individual A has a certain amount of friendship. Individual B has a higher amount of of friendship. Which life is better? But clearly, the one with more friendship is better. How do you explain that? Well, the explanation, according to Brad Hooker, is that friendship itself is a good-making property. And you can do this with other goods. For example, significant achievements. Which life is better? A life of an author who writes 2 books, or an author who writes, all things being equal, of course, you have to imagine. One who writes 2 books, or one who writes 10 books. Well, obviously the life of the one who wrote 10 books. And how do you explain that? Because significant achievements in life make your life good, whether you like it or not. Okay, this is the end of this lecture, and I hope you enjoyed it. This is the end of lecture 5. Remember that the PowerPoint that I showed you on the screen, I hope you saw it, is the PowerPoint posted on my website. Once again, it's 123, the word philosophy.wordpress.com. You can find it there, as well as all the other PowerPoints that I've been showing you in these lectures. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.